The Forgotten Heath by Barrow. It feels like a lifetime since last I wandered there. Years since I felt the cold presence of those terrible things that linger there in the low fog. Yet the feelings I experienced that night remain within me, even to this day. These things, whether metaphysical or indeed something tangible yet unidentified, leave the short hair standing, and the blood running ice cold. I do not know how they came to be there, entangled within the gorse and the bracken that infest that dreadful heath. But I do know this to be true. They still have yet to leave. How I know this I cannot possibly explain so early on in my writing, but more may become clear later. The Forgotten, or Nameless Heath as it is so ironically called, is labelled so out of fear of dark workings and folklore. A true fiend of abhorrent making would surge with powerful evil and spite upon the casting of his true name, and so this name has rightly or wrongly been left behind in long forgotten time. This conundrum does, however, provide us with a possible clue to the area's mysterious past. There are still, to this day, known and named landmarks within the heath, some of which we may get to later, which suggests perhaps that it is the heath or the land itself that holds these dreaded anomalies. All this I have discovered since. I had no prior knowledge of this place before happening upon it, and I have spent many hours in the years since poring over any document or old wives' tale I could find in an attempt to paint a clearer picture. What power dwelt there when this low brush was a place of note, nobody living knows. Rabbits do not burrow there. No bird will fly near its skies. With the exception of the flora, it is altogether desolate. Lost within the thick masses of the forest of Findersday, it is a wholly banal place at first discovery, especially in daylight hours, assuming you've trodden open heathland before. It serves as a breath of fresh air and a break from the stifling maze of pines that block out the sky for miles in every direction. It is, though, utterly dismal in its feeling. If feeling can be used to describe an aspect of a place's geography, of course. It might perhaps be closer to authenticity to say atmosphere instead. What these things were exactly, these terrors in the fog, I lack the adequate nomenclature required to properly convey. They certainly were not something I could have ever conjured in dreams, and the experience, now seared into my memory, cannot possibly be true to any rational mind. But I saw them. I know what I saw. They looked inside me, right into my very spirit, and in that moment I was utterly insignificant. Of course, there must be a reason for me to have sat down here at my bureau to pen this letter to you, and the reason may become clear eventually. Although at this moment in time I'm not sure. I suppose I do have a tale to tell, and I have let it lie quiet for a significant period. A little too long, perhaps, jotting notes here and there, in the off chance that I might one day bring myself some assurance. Perhaps I am mad. Perhaps it was a dream, or a fatigued hallucination. Perhaps it was one accountable incident that others may have experienced, but I have yet to discover any tales of this caliber, and alas, no such relief has yet befallen me. I was the ripe age of 15 years. 15 and 4 days to be precise, and had responded to a correspondence regarding my 3/4 score festivities. Uncle Ackley, on my mother's side, had summoned me to his lodging in Banton, a small, remote fishing village situated west of the forest by Lake Truryn. Myself and mother were dwelling in the much larger town of Long Hillstow to the southeast. Tidings and merriment were to be had at the weekend with my uncle and cousin, Landon, and this, being Wednesday, meant I had a decision to make. Take the north road at approximately 46 miles distance and at least 2 days' travel, or brave Findersday Forest alone, taking half the time in the distance. The south road was out of the question. It was Wednesday already, and I had not the time nor the patience to weather 72 miles of road trudging at such short notice. But still I knew, if I chose the shortest path and my nerves were to fail, so would my quest. And there are much more dangerous things in those woods than phantasma and claustrophobia. This ominous telling is all in hindsight, I must confess, as at the time and at the age I was terribly naive of danger and had already set my mind on adventure. I had ventured into the forest many times with cousin and sibling, foraging for nuts and berries or hunting small game with rudimentary short bows. There also was a rough-hewn path we would take about a mile out of the village up the northern road, so I was sure of myself enough to get this done without guidance. I left as soon as I was able on Thursday morning, probably somewhere within the hour of 9. I headed straight for the forest path and was swimming in pines far before 10 a.m. Going was swift at first. I had a spring in my step and was merrily anticipating the conviviality of the weekend celebrations. It wasn't long, though, until the blinding mass of pine trunks began to mesmerize my mind and poke at my temperament. The trail, though easy to follow, was not at all forgiving in terms of variety. It was all fun and games, fooling with land and chasing squirrels. But with no company and the only objective being walking, it wasn't difficult to become drunk with this mundane recurrence. At first, the trunks themselves became all so similar. The same knots, in the same trees, but in different places. A deep scratch in that one, just like one I saw earlier, and rinse and repeat into oblivion. The trees are trying to tell me something important, and it is my job to decrypt the code and heed the warning. Madness, I know. These skinny trunks here are taking the form of the constellation Orion. These ones, Cetus. Then there were the patterns between the roots. Great triangles and swirling runes appeared and dissipated as my trudging changed the perspective. Pareidolia, it seems, had fully taken over me like some static woodland folly, descending and absorbing into my being. It was an utterly dismal and perplexing journey, trapped within a labyrinth full of living things used to such treacherous terrain. A good 5 or 6 hours had passed when I first took heed of the assailant lurking behind. Silent as the still air it crept, and at great distance, as to not rouse its prey. But intuition, it seems, caused me to take an involuntary glance back to the path behind. I saw a cold, dark shadow quiver for a second, and then swiftly dissolve back into the trees out of view. I stood there still, more out of curiosity than fear, although upon writing this sentence I realize I am no more competent in survival as a man than as a gazelle stalked by a lioness. I stood there for some time, maybe minutes, trying to figure out the situation when the shadow swept across the path, left to right, much closer now, and presenting itself in full view. It was no shadow. In fact, it was a creature all too familiar in tale to me and all who dwell around the outskirts of Finderstay Forest. A black wolf, this one of considerable size by all accounts, and wild fury came with him. Varnuok, the Black Scourge, they named him, and legend is writ that he and his family had laid claim to at least 12 sheep, 8 goats, 4 men, 2 women, and 2 children. One of those children was allegedly kith to my grandfather in his childhood. A tale of unsubstantiated rumor, as the man never liked recalling the loss of his friend Thomas, which I suppose is grounds for truth. They say soldiers who experienced the worst in war speak little of it, and those who didn't boast all day long. By the time our gazes met, he and his kin had not been sighted in Finderstay in at least my lifetime, clouding any account with a layer of myth, and thus forgetfulness of danger. But I stood there, now frozen, realizing the empirical nature of those cautionary tales. My memory is unfortunately incomplete regarding the specifics of these events due to the trauma that ensued with the aggressiveness of his attack. We two locked eyes. The black scourge had cold, soulless black eyes, only identifiable as with the shining gleam of wet stone. Before I could draw breath, he was on me. I flailed desperately at the tormentor with my branch-hewn walking stick, clouting him across his snarling nose and sending a rush of cold vapor from his nostrils into my eyes. His dark gums were salivating profusely as his wicked fangs snapped and clapped at my arms and legs, breaking the skin. He managed a full bite of shank and had me over, dragging me away unnaturally fast even for his size, across the dead needles of the forest floor. I flailed. I clasped at nothing. I was a goner. It was then a sharp pain, a rude on assumption, struck the back of my skull near the neck. That is all I can recall. Growls and snarls faded listlessly into the dark ether of unconsciousness. A voice from beyond called to me from a distance further than my perception. From a nothingness only a brain bashed into unconsciousness could conjure. A disembodied female voice, with a strange language I for some reason understood.
While resistance is futile, apathy bliss may become bedfellows in the void.
Obviously, you may assume, as it is that I am writing this letter some years later, that somehow I survived this ordeal. You are correct, although I know not how. I awoke some hours later in great pain in some place that felt rich with heresy. Twilight was upon the forest, and as I began to rouse myself and check my faculties, I realized I was not in the surreal, monotonous pine maze any longer. Through the boughs I could see the edge of the tree line, and beyond it, an open expanse. I leant up to the closest trunk and rested there for a few minutes, taking inventory of bodily damage and scouting the area for signs of the terror Varnuok. That's when I noticed the utter silence of it. The area was absolutely motionless. Not a leaf quivered in the evening air. Daunting it was, if that is strong enough a word, and altogether otherworldly. I stood myself up. The wounds I had sustained, though painful, seemed fairly inconsequential. Many scratches, some relatively deep but not badly bleeding fang marks on my left shin, and a nice lump on the base of my skull. Relatively unscathed when you consider the fate I surely should have befallen. I had lost almost all of my belongings in the scuffle, save from the clothes on my back, which were layered enough to weather the evening chill. I always had many layers this time of year, and this may have saved me from some nastier lacerations. I trudged forward, out of the tree line. I had found the open air to be fresh, cool, and forgiving. The heath before me was that of a gigantic circle around a mile in diameter. From the tree line, the ground slowly sunk down towards the circle's focus, where at its lowest point a heavy fog lay trapped. Paths of fine grey sand, almost ash-like, lay twisted as veins winding and snaking between bushes of gorse of wonderful colour, a species not found in any botanical working I so far have seen. A deep plum colour, a bizarre contrast to the usual bright yellow. Beyond the expanse, the sun had lowered itself behind the pines. It made sense, then, that I should continue west across the heath, and have a hope that I reached the western road as soon as possible. Going was careful but swift, and as to avoid sounding too absurd or using such euphemistic buzzwords as magic or enchantment, I shall simply say I felt a constant compulsion to aim course for the center of this bowl. As the land sank inward, it of course made more sense to skirt the edges of the heath and make for the western tree line rather than have to tackle the incline on the other side. But as I've said, no matter the chosen path, I found myself affixed on the fog in the low bowl, and in some hypnotic daze I felt myself answering its call. The fog itself, though tremendously thick, only came up to about knee height, maybe 2 feet from the ground. As I took cautious steps, the still grey sheet displaced, writhing and twisting angrily at being disturbed. The air was frigid down here. I felt the prickle of gorse bushes below the surface of the fog as I pushed through, trying not to stumble. I had my eyes set on something in the distance, and my heart was longing to discover it. It glinted, dark, yet consummately appealing, perhaps in the way a jackdaw feels when he spots something shiny. A small mound to the center of the heath, rising only a few centimeters above the fog. This island in the mist was around 7 feet across, a grassy lump adorned with deep black stones. Perhaps this was a sacrosanct site which had fallen victim to the ages, and only its foundations remain as a footprint to a past long forgotten. There was no denying this place had an air of importance to it. Exactly in the center of the crater, and the only spot in the lowest point not shrouded in this bastard fog. This place today is known in writing as Blackstone Cairn, implying that perhaps a cairn or monument once stood there. I admired the alien craftsmanship of each stone sunken into the grass. Such detail, such unimaginable detail with not so much as a tool mark or a scuff left behind. I despaired internally, running my fingers across these perfectly carved grooves that the bastard scourge had robbed me of my belongings. I wished ever so to make a sketch or a rub of these things, that although I swiftly found the surface of the stone to be smooth as glass, suggesting that the carvings lay somehow subsurface. It was in that moment, admiring the delicate and intricate patterns, I realized the ominous implications of such a sight, as an aforementioned terror decided to wake in the broom, making itself known. An icy wave of frisson rolled up my spine as my mesmeric admiration for these ancient intricacies was broken. I realized the fog, or rather something within it, was stirring. I scanned my surroundings, fully expecting to find the black scourge had sought me again, but no. This was far worse. This was truly terror incarnate. This was no being of living realm. It was a creature born of pure nightmare and blasphemy, and I felt my bones quake in its otherworldly presence. To the south stood a foggy humanoid apparition staring at me. Into me. I felt its nothingness. Its endless despair, trapped forever in a void incomprehensible to any consciousness active on earth. This was a tortured soul, if ever there was one, that only beings of higher existence could be culpable for. The pain of its emptiness was utterly unbearable. I collapsed upon the mound, fetal, as, to either side of this phantom, the fog stood up, forming 2 more ghasts. Both stood stoic and formidable. Then 2 more. Then 2 more. I wept. I cannot convey to you the intimidation they wrought upon me. These hellish and doom-bringing figures drew closer, gliding up upon the surface of the mist until they were at striking distance. Then the fog broke away, revealing what I believed to be their true form. A grotesque humanoid mass of spines and sinew, dark plumb spurs protruding from deep pores like vicious stinging hairs. The empty void-like despair left me as I gazed upon these 7 terrors. I'd regained my faculties, and the existential fear left, being replaced with sheer terror of the danger before me. How I got away from these foes more or less unscathed I cannot clearly recall. I remember spotting the last glint of the sunset through the western tree line, and flight took me. I charged for the tree line, daring not to look back. The largest ghast swung a gnarled vine at me, sending a wave of excruciating stabbing through the torso. Adrenaline was searing through me now, and I had not the time to summon a thought of my own. I fled desperately, and the creatures followed, at least for a time, judging by the slithering, writhing sounds that followed my path. But by the time I left the nameless Heath and found courage to look back, they had passed back into that low fog, to my knowledge never to be seen again. I fled the spined serpentine evil. The hellhound and the labyrinthine terror of Findustane collapsed exhausted and broken on the western road. I awoke at Ackerley and Landon's house and was immediately plied with ale. My tale was swiftly neglected for the hysterical babbling of a naive and sheltered lad aching for adventure and tall tales to regale. And so my tale dissipated off into the ether of rumour, as with every other morsel regarding that place I have found. I do, however, possess a modicum of evidence to back my tale, if you could call it that. Once I had drowned my ills in ale and had been escorted by road back home. Upon cleaning myself up, I discovered a large dark bruise under the left arm on my ribcage. I put it down to injuries acquired during my bout with Varnoak. But after the other injuries he gave me left my flesh, and this did not, I grew terribly troubled. Upon closer examination, a month or so after my adventure, I discovered in the center of the bruise, under the skin, lay one of those sick purple barbs from the Heath ghosts. I managed to retrieve the 4-inch needle from my skin by slicing a gash and probing subcutaneously with a pair of tweezers. I have this thing, still now, in a jar locked away if ever the need for study rears itself. 2 years ago, my wife Arantxa fell pregnant for the first time. We were living here, at my current address in Long Hillstow. The pregnancy was a normal one. As normal as growing a child inside of yourself can be, I suppose. The usual morning sickness and fatigue. A strange craving for mud and sea salt. The birth, however, was the real reason I write to you today. The child presented itself living, as far as I could tell, but certainly not normal. Not at all. This lad was absolutely hirsute, and not in any clinical way I know. He was covered, and I mean absolutely so, in thick, coarse, deep plum-coloured hair. The midwife, Odelia Ravenel, had to deal with Arantxa, who was at this point losing a lot of blood. Obviously you know what dark fate befell my love. Truly, truly awful. But what you don't know is the truth about my boy. The official account is that both Arantxa and the lad, who I named for the birth record Vance, both died during childbirth. This, pains me to say, is not the case. You see, the boy was very much alive as an inhuman abomination could be. As Odelia tried to deal with my dear wife, trying to stop the bleeding and getting some opioids into her system to relieve her turmoil, I picked up the boy to check him over and found myself searing with that same stabbing pain. Those thick hairs had sharp points and penetrated the skin of my hands with utmost ease. I whelped in pain, almost dropping the child, who was gurgling, an uncomfortable gargle almost like a monstrous cackle. I grabbed some hard leather gardening gloves and picked him up again. He had deep black, cold eyes. He had no legs. 3 ghastly twisting sprigs shooting from his lower abdomen like legs that had once tried to be legs, but had instead ended up curled in gnarled roots of flesh. This truly was abomination. This was a curse from those eldritch fiends. This was utter blasphemy. Arantxa was declared dead within the hour, and myself and Odelia sat against the bedroom wall, exasperated, covered in sweat and blood, staring at this thing, this wicked, terrible thing, this son of mine. I knew what it meant, although I didn't have the heart, energy, or time to explain all of this to Odelia. It lay in the crib, watching us, silent and waiting, black eyes affixed on us both. We could feel its evil. We eventually knew what we had to do. I stoved the cretinous thing's skull in with a shovel, and we buried the two of them in plots in the back garden besides where Mother and Father lay. Odelia filed and signed the proper paperwork, and that was that. I, as you know, have been drowning in ennui ever since. Not for that awful act on that evil day, but for the loss of my wife. My poor wife, who had to bear the weight of the curse I had collected on that foggy night. I can see the family plot from here. My office window. The double headstone of my parents, left for mother, right for father. The lavish stone I laid for my dear wife, Arantxa. And the fourth plot, far to the right, where a little gravestone sat. You can't see it now, though, at least not from this window. It has been almost completely covered by a thick bush of gorse sprouting from the grave. A unique type of gorse with dark plum-colored flowers I have only seen in one other place. It fills me with deep remorse and regret as to what happened next. As you know, a fortnight after these events, Odelia left this plane by her own hand with a noose, and I was the one to discover her far too late. While these events are indeed genuine and mysterious, what I burden myself with is the fact that I doctored the note that she left behind. Her last words were a full confession of the events that night, and I just could not have that. I couldn't risk anybody else becoming infected with this, whatever this is. The note I left was poor and vague in content, leaving her relatives only painful unanswered questions. Well, now the account is complete. She couldn't live with it, and now no longer can I. And so now it is that we come to the purpose of this writing. Upon the acceptance of this letter, it may grieve you to know that I am no longer. I have lived drowning in grief and despair since that day. I cannot and will not share this burden onto anyone else's soul, God willing, and so as soon as this letter is on its way to you, I will end my life with this Smith & Wesson at this desk. I know not what those 7 eldritch fiends are protecting. Neither do I know the full consequence of trespassing upon that foggy bowl within the dreaded Heath, but I know some foul divine force is keeping them there, protecting that ancient site perhaps. I implore you, do not seek it. Do not go there, and do not come here either. I tried to cleanse the gorse infecting my garden with fire and chemical, and it only grew wilder. I have attempted a wide range of experiments within the spectrum of my scientific knowledge on the bushes and on the spine I keep hidden away, and it seems as though nothing withers the stuff. I know as soon as I pass, my body too will serve as a rotting uterus for this purple gorse to gestate within, so I bid you all keep away. Let the place become as forgotten and forbidden as that horrid Heath. Do not seek it. When my story ends, I will be forced to join them in that fog, to protect that place, to keep it hidden. There is no heaven, no hell. There is either servitude or oblivion, and I am cursed to serve for as long as my heart continues to hurt.